Thanks very much, Stephen. I've been asked just to open this session with about 5 minutes or so of thoughts on, I think, listening to the discussion that came before. I think it's a topic that follows very nicely, which is to think about how globalization and institutions will interact in the Asian century. Probably the first thing that I'm going to say is I'm not entirely sure I would call the 21st century the Asian century. Sorry, Stephen. I think it is going to be more multipolar, and that's probably one of the areas that I'll focus on first, which is it's becoming more multipolar because of the economic growth and rise of Asia, and particularly China. So I'm going to first look at globalization's impact on China and Asia, because I think I sit in economics departments now, but I started my career as a lawyer, and so I tend to look at institutions as rather evolutionary. Are there stakeholders pushing for evolutionary change? And so I'm going to look a bit at globalization's impact, because that will shape the institutions that come. And then I will look specifically at China's emerging global role, which we've already discussed, which I think will be the biggest factor in the coming years in terms of what institutions will arise in this new century. And then finally, some thoughts about global institutions in the 21st century. So I think the first thing to say in terms of globalization's impact is that we've talked a lot about the challenge, I think the backlash against globalization, which we see in the West. When I travel around Asia, this is obviously, nothing is absolute, but for the most part, industrializing countries don't face the same backlash as advanced economies for, I think, lots of reasons, but the main one, perhaps, is that wage pressures work the other way in emerging economies. In other words, we know that factor price equalization tells us that wages of nations in the traded sector converge towards each other. So that implies that for the most part, for advanced economies, there's stagnation of wages, downward wage pressure, but in the other nations that are trading with advanced economies, the wage pressures in the traded sector actually go the other way. So they've experienced wage increases. So for, I think, that reason, as well as others, you don't have the same antipathy against globalization at the moment, at least. And the other thing about, particularly, I think, China, when globalization, particularly rules-based system rules come into play, such as when China adopted WTO rules on accession in 2001, it can hasten economic reforms, including against domestic political opposition. So in other words, in countries which are emerging, institutions have yet to take shape. And sometimes those institutions can be very difficult to develop against vested interests. It's one of the arguments for why it is countries which are emerging or in transition or developing, which would capture large swathes of Asia, those institutions are developing towards a international best practice. That's the optimal policy route. The reality is there are those who have a vested interest in keeping the system as it is. And so globalization, by introducing rules, which, at least on trade, remember the WTO rules are very specific. They create international trade law, and we can talk about some of the other areas, but on this point alone, it actually helps overcome political opposition. So a lot of these countries have benefited from the rules-based system, but the track record of international financial institutions in Asia, if you think back to the Asian financial crisis, it's a much more checkered history. So the governance, the institutions, the IMF in particular, but also the other ones, have more, particularly the IMF, of a mixed track record. And the representation as to who makes the decisions in the Bretton Woods institutions, of course, is predominantly run by the West, those who won the Second World War. And so as these countries are asked to give more, which they have been after the global financial crisis, I think it's quite natural they want a greater say. So that leads me nicely, I think, to China, which is, there's three areas about China's emerging global role in the economic sphere I thought I would just highlight. The first one is China is clearly creating regional, supranational institutions. So the most notable one is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So if Danny Alexander had been here, he would have been well placed to talk about it. And this institution, being China-led, of course, it's not the only one. There's other initiatives in the region of which China is a part, such as the Chiang Mai Initiative, that may also begin to set a regional institution up, which might mirror some of what the IMF does, whereas obviously the AIIB is in the sphere of the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and China's reasons for setting it up, I think, are pretty apparent. This need to have a say. There's also China's unilateral overseas investment. So the Belt and Road Initiative has already been talked about. As we all know, there are no international investment rules. So international trade law is just that. It's trade of manufactured goods. Investment is all done on a bilateral basis through BITs. So China's movements in terms of overseas investment has a global impact, which are not governed by the rules-based system as we know it. And then finally, the greater role in existing IFIs. I think this is well-trodden ground. We're very familiar with it. If somebody wants to have a greater say, someone else has to have a lesser say. But I think progress has been slow, perhaps, from China's perspective. But there has been some progress. I was chairing recently at UNIDO. The head of UNIDO is a Chinese national. One of the second in command at the IMF is a Chinese national. But I think there's still some ways to go before my final points around the global institutions of the 21st century, what that means when reform is slow. I probably have three questions in terms of what the upsum is from this, in terms of what institutions will look like in this century. So the first one is who decides? So in terms of the formal institutions, the governance institutions, so who decides at the IMF, at the World Bank? Can Asian emerging economies really have a greater say? Is it really going to be more of a more multipolar institution? Second question is, who sets the rules? So there are global norms, if not global laws, for a number of things, but who sets the norms, who sets the rules? And I think from a lot of emerging economies, they weren't there when the rules were set. So are the rules fit for purpose? So it's one thing to talk about a rules-based system, but are the rules, who sets them, and are they sufficiently designed for emerging economies in Asia? And I think that, I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that because we've already talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, but there's others as well, such as the rules for aid, the rules for financial assistance. And then finally, whose interests prevail when we talk about global coordination? So something around financial stability has already been mentioned. So if you have a recurrence of global imbalances, is it really possible for a global imbalance that's been identified by the IMF to result in national governments modifying their strategies to suit a global purpose? So if low interest rates in the United States are leading to an asset bubble in Asia, will that really change US monetary policy? I think the answer is probably not. So what does global coordination mean? Whose interest prevails? So then finally, my final thoughts are that I think we like to talk, economists like a first best world, but I think we're probably not in a first best world. So I think regional institutions will play a role alongside multilateral ones. So we will have a more fragmented system. I think these economies with a new global middle class, and this is actually where the the support for globalization could come from, because they have benefited from globalization thus far, until they get to the deindustrialization phase, in which case I hope they will have learned the lessons of the West. So you have a growing middle class in a region of the world which is more embracing of globalization. So they could be more supportive of and recognize the need to have a system of governance, whether it's formal, informal, structures, rules, norms, that's more representative of a multipolar world. And can the old institutions do that? And then finally, Asian economies, even including China, are open economies. So it is quite apparent that governance of markets is more obviously needed. But it's not obvious what that governance is. So in Southeast Asia, they're setting up their own single market, the AEC, for instance, established at the end of 2015. They're setting up their own rules in terms of governing cross-border trade, at least initially. So I think I'll pause there. I think we will have to be quite innovative in terms of the institutions around globalization. But I think, at least with some of these Asian economies, I think there might be a more ready audience for thinking about how to make globalization, how to push against the backlash from globalization, because they are, at the moment, the beneficiaries. But they're not, at the moment, mostly at the table.